Well, hello everybody. Today I'm going to be interviewing Professor Michael Potter, our Cambridge expert on all things early analytic philosophy. We're going to be talking today about Frank Ramsey, who is one of the early analytics, but maybe less famous than Frege, Russell and Wittgenstein, the three that are most famously associated with early analytic philosophy. But he really does deserve to be among those three greats. He was employed in Cambridge as a mathematician. He wrote on things as wide as economics, mathematics, and philosophy. Unfortunately, he died very young at the tender age of 26, but by that stage, he had still written several works that have been influential since. And we're going to be looking at one of them in particular, Ramsey's paper, Universals. So to join me to talk about Universals is Professor Potter. And so what we thought we would start with is to talk a little bit about Ramsey, his relationship with Wittgenstein, and to get a bit of context for this paper. Michael.
Yes. Well, as you said, he had an astonishing career for someone who died so tragically young at the age of 26. But he packed a huge amount into that very short period. So he was an undergraduate mathematician at Trinity College, Cambridge. While he was an undergraduate, he was asked to do the English translation of the Tractatus. So when it came out with German and English on opposite pages, the English had been drafted by Ramsey and then corrected by Wittgenstein. So that was when he was still an undergraduate. Then when he graduated from Cambridge, he then went to Austria for a couple of weeks and visited Wittgenstein, who by then, of course, was a primary school teacher there. And they talked about the book, line by line, talked about the various things about it. Then he came back to Cambridge. He very soon got a job at King's College, Cambridge, as a mathematician. And then this paper, Universals, that we're going to talk about, he actually wrote because of that familiar modern problem of needing publications, because although he had a college job in Cambridge, he wanted to apply for a university lectureship, which is a different kind of post. And because he was applying for that job, he needed a couple publications, and he wrote this paper in something of a hurry in order just to boost his application. So it's an astonishing paper for someone so young. So this is 1926, so he was 23 when he wrote it. I have to say the paper does bear signs, I think, of having been written in a hurry. It's a bit of a mess in its layout, which is one of the reasons that people often misunderstand it. It's striking how it's a paper with enormously interesting arguments, but ones which lots of commentators seem to have misunderstood. So that's why it's particularly interesting, I think, today to talk about it and see if we can make a better job than some of the commentators on understanding what it's about.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, hopefully. Very much so. Well, there's also, just for anyone who's interested to look more into the biographical elements of Ramsey, there's a very good, was it a BBC production that Hugh Mellor did?
Yep. So it's quite a long time ago now. There's also, of course, a big biography by Cheryl Misak, which came out only about a year or so ago, and it's a remarkably fat book for a biography of someone who died at 26. But as I said, he packed a lot in, so there isn't much padding in that biography.
Yeah. Well, so you can get the biography. You can. I think the Hugh Mellor listen is about, is it 20 minutes, 40 minutes, something like that as well, and you can find that on Google. It's very interesting. For example, one of the things I will never forget from watching it is that Ramsey, you'd mentioned he translated the Tractatus, but there's this story there about how he effectively taught himself to read German in about 2 weeks so that he could do it.
That's a story. I don't think that's true. Actually, he did.
Oh, okay.
He did German when he was a schoolboy at Winchester. He won a German prize, I think, at Winchester.
Oh well, there you go.
Sorry to
not everything. Proof that not everything that comes out of the BBC is quite 100% accurate. Then
I couldn't possibly comment.
Yeah, we can move on from that. But regardless, he's obviously when anyone reads what he's written, we can see a genius at work, and so he is quite remarkable, and definitely not a lesser one of the early analytics, as we will discover. For anyone who wants to know where you can get universals, my copy anyway is in the philosophical papers, which includes, I think, everything Ramsey wrote is in here. There's certainly quite a lot. They edited by Hugh Mellor, so that's available for anyone who wants to have a book of their own. I'll put a link in the description maybe to it for those who want to know.
And of course, the original paper is available online. I don't know if it's universal. I think it must be universal access. So if you Google it, I'm sure you can find a copy of it easily.
Yeah. Okay. I'll put a link in the description to whatever I find about as well. So if you want to have a read to make more sense of what we're going to talk about, then you can do that too. But hopefully you won't need to, because what we're going to try and do is make sense of what he's talking about there. So we'll get to universals then in a minute, the actual paper. But first, it's going to be helpful to have a little bit of background, I think, isn't it? So obviously, he's writing in this certain kind of context of logical atomism. And as you'd mentioned, he'd been conversing with Wittgenstein about the Tractators. So how does his paper sort of fit with logical atomism and the Tractators, Michael?
I think it's central to it. I think the paper is written with that in its background. So he, at certain points, I think, assumes that Tractarian background. So the key idea there is that sentences of ordinary language can be analysed to show their true logical structure. This is an idea that Wittgenstein gets from Russell. And the idea is that when you break down a sentence to exhibit its true logical structure, that process has to stop at some point. And when it stops, you can't analyse any further. You analyse down to what Wittgenstein in the Tractators calls elementary propositions. So elementary propositions are the ones that you dive down as far as you can get, and there's nowhere further you can go. So those propositions are logically simple. And so the argument in universals is about what the structure of those elementary propositions has to be. Now, there's a common idea that people like Russell had, which is that when you get to things, well, Russell didn't call them elementary propositions, he would call them atomic, but when you get down to those basic sentences, they're going to have a form where there's a subject and then there's a predicate, or there might be two subjects and then a relation between them. So, Socrates is mortal, that would be subject predicate. John loves Mary would be relational. But the idea is that those are the kinds of structures that you would expect the elementary propositions to have. And so there's a key distinction there, which people assumed, which is that there's basically two kinds of elements that will happen in these logically basic, simple sentences. There'll be subject kind of terms, and then there'll be, well, in grammatical terms, there'll be verb kind of terms, or predicate terms, or whatever you want to call them. So there'll be two kinds of terms. Mm-hmm. And so the key question is there a logical reason why there should be this binary distinction between two kinds of terms at the basic level? Now, Wittgenstein in the Tractators, strikingly, had said that there isn't this binary distinction. So he says that the elementary propositions just consist of names. Now, the word name there, he's using in a technical sense. To mean whatever are the bits of an elementary proposition. But what he doesn't say is, and these names come in two kinds. So Wittgenstein doesn't assert this binary distinction. But in the Tractators, he offers no argument whatever why this should be the case. What Ramsey's doing in Universals is trying to supply the argument for the Tractarian claim.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And that's sort of how you open your chapter on universals in your book, The Rise of Analytic Philosophy. Excellent book. I recommend to anybody. So the idea here is that Ramsey seems to agree with Wittgenstein's position on the logical ingredients of these elementary or atomic propositions, but recognized that Wittgenstein didn't have an argument. And Wittgenstein does need an argument, really, doesn't he, more than he gives, because obviously Frege and Russell had a very different view. And can I also we'll talk about that as we'll talk about Frege and Russell and how they differ as part of this question, but also I think it's quite helpful to see that there's obviously some additional philosophical relevance to the question beyond just what bits make up elementary propositions, because certainly Wittgenstein's idea is that, the world is the nature of, but basically the idea that the world is the sum total of what is the case, or it's made up of facts. And so if your elementary propositions, the ingredients of your elementary propositions are then in some sense the ingredients of reality or ingredients of the world. Is that right?
Or correspond to, yeah. So the picture theory in the Tractatus says that there's an identity of structure between a proposition, which is essentially linguistic, and the piece of the world that would make that proposition true. So correspondingly, if elementary propositions consist of names with no binary distinction among the names, then correspondingly, according to the picture theory, the atomic facts or states of affairs that are the basic stuff of the world will consist of objects with no binary distinction among objects. So again, object in the Tractatus is a technical term, just as name is a technical term. Object doesn't mean ordinary, table, chair or whatever. It means whatever are the basic components of the atomic facts. So there's a metaphysical conclusion, or there's a linguistic conclusion. Because of the picture theory, you can move backwards and forwards between talking about language and talking about the world and read off things about structure in either direction.
So actually, in some ways, then we have sort of a simpler or more parsimonious atomism if our elementary propositions are constituted by only one type of thing. Right. So how does that idea of the elementary propositions just consisting of names which correspond to objects compares with, say, Russell and Frege?
Well, Frege had made a binary distinction very early in his work in Begriffsschrift, which in a way is the book which started it all. I mean, you very kindly held up my book, which of course in its subtitle starts things at 1879. Yeah. The reason I picked 1879, of course, is that's the year that Frege published Begriffsschrift, which is the book which gave birth to modern polyadic logic with quantifiers and variables. And Frege makes this distinction, which he only a couple of years later calls the saturated, unsaturated distinction. So the idea here is that Frege's account of quantification is you take a sentence, e.g., Socrates is mortal, you remove part of that sentence, e.g., the word Socrates, but you need to put something in the place of Socrates to mark the gap. So you get X is mortal. And then once you've got X is mortal, you can put a quantifier on the front for all X to get for all X, X is mortal, which is the logical notation for everyone is mortal. So there's this technique of removing something from a sentence, putting a variable, an X or a Y or a Z or whatever, in that place to mark the position, and then putting a quantifier on the front. That's Frege's account of how quantification works. So Frege thinks that among the expressions that we write as logicians, there's a fundamental distinction between two kinds of expressions, those which contain argument places and those which don't. So things that don't contain argument places he calls saturated. Things that do contain argument places he calls unsaturated. So his idea is that putting something into the argument place is like saturating it. It's filling up the argument place. So that's the distinction Frege draws, a binary distinction, based on his idea of quantification. Frege then thinks that that distinction between saturated and unsaturated should be used to explain how basic sentences are formed. So Frege will then go on to think that in logic, your basic building block sentences, the ones that Wittgenstein is going to call the elementary ones, will have that kind of shape. There'll be things like, well, John loves Mary, broken down into John, Mary, and X loves Y. Mm-hmm. So Frege's account would be John loves Mary has 3 bits to it. 2 of those bits are saturated, John, Mary, they don't have argument places. The 3rd bit, X loves Y, has 2 argument places. So Frege's account is going to be that there's this binary distinction that logic imposes on elementary propositions. Mm-hmm. Russell basically follows Frege in that. Then Ramsey comes along to explain why he thinks that their assumption that there's this binary distinction at the atomic level is wrong. One real oddity of the paper, which I think may well go back to this point about how Ramsey wrote in a hurry, is that Frege's name does not occur in the paper.
Yes.
It doesn't talk about Frege, although throughout the paper he is actually talking about, in many places in the paper, about this Fregean idea. He just doesn't mention Frege. When he wants to mention it, he mentions Russell's inheritance of that idea. Right. But it is really the Fregean idea that's underlying it. Yeah.
Okay, so obviously with Frege, the sentence is splitting into sort of saturated and unsaturated parts, runs right through his semantics as well. So we then have this idea of senses, some being of the sort that need to be stuck together with other types to form thoughts, that a thought can be analyzed in the same way as a sentence. And then similarly in the realm of reference, we have the objects as being that which is referred to by the saturated elements of the sentence, and then concepts being referred to by the unsaturated. And Russell seems to have something similar as well in his semantics. I'm interested to know, and obviously Wittgenstein we've talked about as well with his picture theory. Did Ramsey think in those terms as well? Did he think there was some sort of grand metaphysical conclusion from this?
He doesn't talk about that explicitly in the paper, but I think that's just because he assumes the Tractarian background. He's not explaining the Tractarian background here because I think he assumes that's the context of it. But yes, I think he did think that logic matches up with metaphysics to that extent, at least at this stage. I mean, some of his other work may go in a different direction, but at this stage, yeah, I think so.
So he's trying to defend not only then sort of the Tractarian view of what are the building blocks of logic, but also then what are the building blocks of the world in a way then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I think we've probably talked about enough of the background. We know what Ramsey's trying to do and what he's got in his sights. So how does he go about arguing that, overcoming the binary idea?
The core idea he has is that Socrates is mortal can be split up into 2 parts, Socrates and X is mortal, or it can be split up into 2 parts with mortality and the other bit. Now, it's not so easy to express that second way of splitting it up in English, so I suppose it would be something like mortality Socratizes. So mortality then would be the subject and Socratizes would be the predicate. So the core idea is that Ramsey thinks there is no ultimate logical reason to prefer the analysis that all of us would instinctively offer, Socrates and X is mortal, to the other way round. Now, that's the core idea. That's the simple bit. I think that's easy to grasp, okay? But then the complicated bit of the paper is when Ramsey tries to do something a bit subtler, which is to say, why is it then, if this is so obvious that you can split up Socrates as mortal in 2 ways, why is it that we have this, what he calls the felt difference? That's to say, why is it that we all think it's natural to split it up in one way? And why did Russell and Frege, well, he doesn't mention Frege, but why does Russell think it's natural to split it up in one way rather than the other? So Ramsey thinks he needs a more sophisticated argument to see why people as logically in the know as Russell might ever have thought that there was this binary distinction. And that's where it gets a bit cleverer and a bit harder to understand, because what Ramsey then says is, on the face of it, there is actually a distinction between the two parts, which is that if I analyze it as into Socrates and X is mortal, there are actually two possible ranges for the X there. That's to say, you can have is mortal, and the narrow range of possible substitutions, which is just Socrates is mortal, Aristotle is mortal, Plato is mortal. You could slot different names into the X position to complete is mortal. That's the narrow range. But he says there's also a wider range of propositions that contain the phrase is mortal, such as the proposition everyone is mortal, or someone is mortal, or everyone except Plato is mortal, or Socrates is mortal unless Plato is foolish. There are lots of propositions that contain is mortal, all of which are in a sense completions of is mortal, but in a wider sense than this narrow range of propositions, which is just the Socrates is mortal, Plato is mortal, Aristotle is mortal set. So for that way of breaking it up, we've got two ranges, narrow and wide. If you split it up the other way round, as mortality Socratizes, or whatever you want, on the face of it, there's only one range. And so he says that's the explanation, that there is this apparent asymmetry between the two ways of splitting it up. But he says that's only an apparent asymmetry, because really there is a way of making the narrow-wide distinction in the predicate position. If you make a distinction among predicates between simple and complex predicates, which would be the analogue of the distinction among subjects between simple subjects like Socrates and complex subjects like everyone, or everyone except Plato, or whatever. So this is the bit that's a bit harder to get your head around, the idea that he's saying, although we don't in practice distinguish among predicates or adjectives, as you might also think of it, between simple adjectives and complex adjectives, you could do. So the idea is that among subject terms, we have complex subjects like everyone, or just conjunctions. So, for example, Socrates and Plato, that's a complex subject, which it sounds complex to us. We think that Socrates and Plato isn't a single entity, it's two people.
This is what helped me understand the paper a little bit too.
Yeah.
Is that if you go into this thinking, and feel free to correct me, by the way, as I'm sure you would, instead of thinking that he's trying to say that there's no distinction between these ultimate ingredients of elementary propositions, he thinks there is still two different classes. It's just that there's a symmetry there, that they're both, it doesn't matter which one you call objects, which one you would call functions or whatever. There's you still need to put wisdom and Socrates together, but it's just that you could do it either way round. So there's you could go one way or the other, which is what the difference is. There's nothing hardwired into wisdom as being a certain kind of entity that is of a different kind to in an ultimate kind of descriptive way. So they're just categories that need to stick together, a bit like a plus and a minus maybe, or something. Maybe that's not a very good analogy.
I think one important point here, though, is remember that Ramsey's claim is not that there is no distinction among basic kinds of entities. It's that logic doesn't impose a binary distinction. So it's, for all that the paper says, it's possible that we would end up thinking there was a binary distinction, but not for logical reasons. So we might, in the end, think that, to give an example, traditional metaphysics makes a binary distinction. It calls it the distinction between particulars and universals. It traditionally distinguished them by saying a particular has one position in space at any given time. A universal, like redness, has lots of positions at a single time. There's redness all over the place. Now, that's a distinction, but that's not a logical distinction, because that's to do with space and time. And the idea is that logic isn't limited to just talking about the spatiotemporal. So the paper is not addressing that kind of way of drawing a distinction. It's just asking whether fundamentally there's a distinction which logic has to impose on absolutely everything we can think about as broken down in a binary way.
Yes, that's right. So from a logical point of view, these categories of fundamental bits and pieces, there's no reason why one should be described or understood differently to the other. That is that right? And then so the way, just sort of summarize it in the way I understood it in case it's helpful for people, because it is a complicated argument, as you said. His sort of method for arguing for that is then to say kind of, well, whatever you can do to one, I can show you can do to the other. And this felt difference has arisen just because of our habit, or what is convenient or practical for us and our way of language, or something to do with the way language is structured. But if we're going to look at this logically, there's no logical distinction. And so every time you think, well, here's a reason why, like you talk about when you sort of analyze a sentence. So Socrates is wise is the one that I used in my lecture on it. So you think, like you said, the reason why we might think Socrates is saturated and is wise is unsaturated is because we easily replace Socrates with Plato is wise, Aristotle is wise, or whatever. But that's easily overcome, as you'd said at the beginning, because you can then say, well, similarly, we can do Socrates is wise, Socrates is foolish, Socrates is big. We can switch it that way around too. But we have these complex ones that is different, and we can easily think of complex adjectives. Socrates is wise and Greek and inspired a character of Plato's writings or whatever. But similarly, Ramsey says we don't do it as often, but we could just do Socrates and Plato is wise, or we can have these subject terms that are also complex and put those in with the predicates. Am I along the right lines with that?
Yeah, and the key point here is that what he thinks Russell had missed is that you can make the simple complex distinction in the predicate. It's just we tend not to, because for human concerns it's not terribly useful. But there's no logical reason not to do it. So if you think of an example like the predicate is intelligent and the predicate is a biped, put those two together, is intelligent and a biped. Well, we've got a simple term for that, which is human.
Right.
Human is an intelligent biped. So the fact that we have a single word, human, for that apparently complex intelligent biped, that's the way language operates. It tends to encourage us to think that there's no core simple complex distinction in the predicate position. That's the point that where Ramsey's saying, well, that's just human interest for you. That's the felt difference, but it's only a felt difference. It's not a logical difference.
Yeah. Do you think so this is moving a little bit away and maybe going sort of into more contemporary logic, but do you think that with as a plural logic has been explored a little bit more, do you think that would make it an easier argument to make if we think that we do get plural terms that are irreducible to singular terms, so things that are not just, say, sets of objects, but actually just plural terms, such as, we can say Socrates and Plato, or we could say the early analytics were philosophers. I mean, that's a subject that is a complex subject, because it's not a singular thing. We're talking about a complex of people that don't, and more than the sum of their parts. They need to be understood in a certain kind of way. Do you think that would make Ramsey's argument easier, more obvious, change the way we feel about things?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think probably would make it easier, because actually that helps us to move on to another possible argument against Ramsey, which he considers later in the paper, which is, he says, if you look at the way logicians handle atomic sentences, what they've tended to do, what Russell had done, for example, in the second edition of Principia, was Russell had assumed that the atomic sentences are things like fx or xry or whatever, where in Russell's logic there is a way of reintroducing this binary distinction, because the predicate terms in Russell's way of doing it, the F or the R, or the unsaturated bits, to use Frege's terminology, have a fixed arity, to use the logical term, a fixed number of things they can go together with to form a complete sentence. So a one-place one is like the F, so fx. A two-place is a relational thing, xry, so it's got two positions. So they have a fixed number of argument places, but the subject terms, the A and the B and the C or whatever, they can fit in the argument place of a one-place predicate to give you something complete, or they can fit in the argument places of a two-place predicate. So in Russell's way of conceiving of things, there is a binary distinction between those things that have a fixed arity, a fixed number of things they can go together with, and those things that have a variable arity, a variable number of things they can go with. Now, again, Ramsey's argument is, well, that's just how Russell chose to do it, but logic doesn't actually require that the atomic sentences should have that form. And that's the connection with plural logic, because, in fact, Russell is imposing something which even ordinary language doesn't really do, because in ordinary language, verbs don't have a fixed arity. You know, if you think of like baked a cake, well, one person can bake a cake or several people can bake a cake. So baked a cake has a variable arity in ordinary language. It can take a singular subject, or it can take a plural subject. So John, Mary, and Simon baked a cake together. You know, so plural logic is based on that idea of variable arities. So in that respect, it's actually bearing out Ramsey's side of the argument as against Russell. Yeah. But
I mean, I'm not that up with the history of logic, but plural logic wasn't really well understood or well formulated at the time Ramsey was writing, was it?
No. Frege had been so successful in imposing singular logic, and people like Russell and Peano, of course, who logic in the early part of the 20th century was popularized by the Peano-Russell tradition rather than Frege. Frege's work wasn't much read at that point, but they all popularized the singular way of doing it. So all the quantification is singular. Russell mentions plural logic a few times. He was aware of it, but it wasn't popular.
So, I'm hesitant to go too far away from Ramsey, but just sort of to maybe round this off, especially as you've got such an understanding of mathematics as well. Is there much was it because of the motivation? Because is there much motivation mathematically to include plural variables?
I don't think so.
More a natural language.
At any rate, mathematics gets on fine with singular quantification. So mathematicians haven't generally felt the need for it. So the motivation to study plural logic has come generally from philosophers who think it's interesting because ordinary language is full of it, rather than from any mathematical necessity. Yeah.
So hence, it's probably a blind spot for Frege and Russell, the great champions of set theory. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, great. That's really interesting. A bit of an aside, but so you'd mentioned we didn't go into it, but well, maybe we did a little bit, but it maybe there's sort of these two different things that Ramsey says we should then account for if they're the same. So one was this felt difference that we've talked about, which is something to do with the way in natural language we tend to go with analyzing sentences. But as we just discussed in plural logic, it isn't the only way we go. And then the other thing was to do with the way mathematicians, their notation. And their notation tends to be making a distinction between, say, x as a variable over the domain, and then some function where in the mathematical notation, we also have this space, don't we? We'd say f of x. We don't tend to just write f. So Ramsey he felt that needed to be addressed as well. So how did he do that?
Basically, it's the same idea. His claim is that our interests will lead us to split things up one way, but that will be a matter of our interests and there'll be nothing ultimate to it, that we could choose which bits will treat as the basic bits. Once you've done that, then lots of other logical consequences will follow. So once you've decided that you're splitting things up as Socrates and X is mortal, then you'll get a theory of types, a hierarchy of types built up on that, but that will all depend on your initial decision as to how to break up the atomic sentences. If you had broken up the atomic sentences differently, your hierarchy of types would be formed differently. So it's this idea that these are choices we make that are not imposed ultimately by logic.
Okay, great. So I think we probably summarized his argument. So I'll just quickly summarize before we go on to potential objections. So the idea then is that from a logical perspective, there's no reason to have sort of a hardwired binary distinction between the ultimate constituents of our elementary propositions. Whatever you can say about what we might otherwise have thought of as an object, we can also say about what we might otherwise have thought about as a universal. And so he's shown that notationally and in terms of that's just arbitrary. It's just a matter of how we've done it for our own purposes. There are pragmatic reasons, but no logical reasons for it. And similarly, the felt differences are about language and what we tend to do with language, but there's no logical reason for the distinction. Closes the book then by sort of arguing that Wittgenstein, from a logical perspective, is right. There's just these single type ingredients that we can then apply various metaphors to understand how the unity of the proposition works. So as Wittgenstein's is the chain links holding together. I'm trying to remember whether Ramsey provides his own. Does he provide his own analogies as well?
I can't remember.
Yeah.
Possibly.
But so, I mean, you can use...
So just to interject, the core idea then is that whatever metaphor it is that you use to explain how basic sentences are built up out of their constituents is a different metaphor from the metaphor of how once you've got a whole sentence, you do this Fregean Begriffsschrift thing of removing parts of it to be able to quantify it. So that there are two things. Frege thought there was just one kind of operation that leads to a saturated, unsaturated distinction. The Wittgenstein-Ramsey idea is that there are two, that there's quantification works one way and building up sentences out of their basic components works another way. Now, this idea of there being two different ways of combining was taken up by Michael Dummett, and he made it central in his exegesis of Frege. Well, actually not exegesis. This is the point in which he goes beyond Frege. He's saying Frege didn't do this, but Frege, he thinks, should have done this to make coherent sense. Frege should have distinguished what Dummett calls a distinction between simple predicates and complex predicates. So Complex predicate is Dummett's name for the Phrygian saturated, unsaturated distinction. Simple predicate is Dummett's name for, if you want to analyze the building blocks of, I mean, the example Dummett gives, I think, is Herbert snores. So that's built up from Herbert and snores. And if you want, you can write that as X snores and shove Herbert in the X position. But the point is, the way of building up the simple sentence Herbert snores out of Herbert and snores isn't the Phrygian notion of taking a sentence apart to expose its structure in different ways.
Yeah, if I remember rightly, Dummett sort of argues that Frege does implicitly have the two, but he wasn't aware of it, kind of thing. And occasionally he says things that conflict with it, but we should just not worry about that.
Yeah, it's charitable exegesis. He's saying that Frege almost, yes, I mean, he's right. Frege does say some things in some places which suggest that he is making the distinction, but in other places he doesn't.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, I take issue with Dummett's interpretation there, but we won't get sidetracked too far. Okay, so how has universals generally been received in the philosophical community? Do people think that Ramsey was pretty much right, or were there some early objections, some contemporary objections? What's the state of play with this?
Most people who've written about it seem to think Ramsey was mistaken. I think the most widespread criticism among leading commentators is the negation point, which Anscombe and Geach and Dummett all separately made as an objection to it. And you can see why, because on the face of it, that you can see why it looks as if they do have a good objection. The objection is very simple. It's that they think Ramsey simply ignored the fact that negation attaches to predicates, not subjects. Now, negation is a logical notion, if anything is. So if they're right that negation, a logical notion, attaches only to predicates, not subjects, there's your logical distinction. So the idea is, if you negate Socrates is wise, you negate it by putting the wise in the predicate position. Socrates is unwise or not wise. So every predicate has a negative, a contrary, whereas subjects just don't have contradictories or whatever in the same way. So you can't negate Socrates is wise by saying unsocrates is wise, because what's unsocrates? There isn't, for every object in the world, a symmetrical anti-object which has all the properties that the original object doesn't have.
Yeah.
We don't all have doppelgangers who are negatives, are mirror images logically, whereas predicates do seem to have mirror images. Every predicate seems to have a mirror image predicate, which applies to all the things that the original predicate didn't apply to. So we seem to have the asymmetry that Ramsey's denying.
Yes, I can see that. And you'd mentioned that in an email to me earlier. And for me, we haven't discussed this, but for me, that just, if I was Ramsey, I'd say, well, you haven't fully understood what I said, because, I mean, we gave the example, or you gave the example of mortality is Socratizes, or I think wisdom is Socratic. Is that a one that Ramsey uses, or have I just invented that one? But something along those lines. If you think that the subject predicate way of expressing can be expressed the opposite direction, where the predicate term becomes the subject, then all of a sudden it looks like you can negate the subject by wisdom is not Socratic, or mortality doesn't Socratize. So am I just being a bit naive with that? Have people talked about that as well?
The thing is, though, if you ask, what is this property of being unsocratic or of not Socratizing? I suppose the trouble is that you can say the words wisdom is unsocratic, but then if you ask, what does it mean for wisdom to be unsocratic? Very soon you're going to have to turn it back round and start talking about properties of Socrates, because after all, I take it in this phrasing, wisdom is Socratic. Being Socratic just means being a property that Socrates has. So if you translate it back round the other way, I think you'll come back to the point that Anscombe, Geach and Demeter made, which is that, as it were, it's their sense of reality is that we don't have logical mirror images, but predicates do have logical mirror images. And that seems difficult to get away from.
Yeah.
So I think the correct response to it, though, is already, I mean, you're right to say it's already in Ramsey's paper. It's not that Ramsey hadn't spotted this. Ramsey had spotted it and thought he'd explained it.
Oh,
and it's just that.
Okay, I'm very excited. Can I try and preempt where you might be going?
Yeah.
And then I'm very interested to hear your views on it as well. So again, if I was Ramsey, I'd just say, yeah, but you're not talking about, this isn't, Socrates is wise, this isn't an elementary proposition. If you get down to the elementary propositions, we don't know what these things are. If I'm thinking like Wittgenstein, we get to a point where we just have names of objects in a row, at which point, who knows what doesn't unsocratizes or whatever is ultimately. If you're saying that there's something special about, or that's something weird about that, that's because of your metaphysical bias, and that's not a logical position. There's no reason why logically it wouldn't come out in the wash when we get down to the elementary level. Is that? Yeah.
I mean, look, there's an interesting point here, which is about the way that language works. It's about the notion of presupposition. That we tend, in the traditional subject-predicate form of sentence, the idea is that you presuppose in saying something the existence of certain things which are not asserted in the sentence, but they're presupposed. So when we talk about saying Socrates is wise or Socrates isn't wise, we presuppose that there's someone called Socrates. Right? When I say Socrates is wise, I don't in that sentence say, and Socrates exists. That's just presupposed by the sentence. And so there's this tendency in language, certainly in English, but the same pattern exists in other languages, of putting presuppositions typically early in sentences. Now, let's go back to the Tractatus a minute. Remember, we were saying the Tractatus background, which Ramsey is assuming, is that this process of analysis comes to a stop at the elementary propositions. If you look in the Tractatus for the argument for that claim, the argument that you do get down to basics, his argument, so-called argument for substance, in the 2.02s, is essentially this presupposition idea. His argument is, anything you say has to presuppose something else. You can't wrap all the presuppositions of what you're trying to say into the sentence itself. The presuppositions are just what we call the objects. So he's relying on this idea of presuppositions, and the idea is that all the bits are presuppositions just as much as one another when you get down to the elementary level. Now, at the level of ordinary language, Socrates is wise, this is really the point you've just been making, it doesn't work like that. So at the level of ordinary language, Socrates is presupposed, and then we say of Socrates something, namely, he is or isn't wise. So we put the negation halfway through the sentence, apply it to the predicate, but at the basic level, you can negate the whole sentence, but why should you negate one bit of it rather than another bit? When you get down to the atomic level, or the elementary level, Ramsey and Wittgenstein are saying there's no general reason why one bit should be regarded as a presupposition and another bit not a presupposition. They're all going to be presupposed. In order to get representation going, you're going to have to presuppose a world of things. And whatever the things are the Tractarian objects. They're the presuppositions. So the notion of presupposition as it works at the level of ordinary language isn't the notion as it works at the elementary level.
Mm.
Again, that's felt. Ramsey's going to say that's a matter of felt difference. That's not ultimate.
Yeah. Okay. So do you think that Ramsey's argument is sound?
Given the Tractarian background, yes.
Yeah. It seemed that way. I mean, I'm no logical atomist, but it seemed to follow from where he began. Yeah.
Yes. But of course, the big problem here is the logical atomism. I mean, I mentioned the argument for substance, but it seems to me the argument for substance is probably the big flaw of the Tractatus. Now, of course, that would be a matter for a whole other hour of discussion. But I do think that's, if there is a weakness, it's there. So Ramsey's paper, I flip between thinking it's really important and thinking it's just a bywater, in the history of philosophy. If we're not logical atomists, why should we take it seriously? So I think the bit that survives, whether or not you're a logical atomist, which I think is right, is this distinction, the one that Dummett called the simple complex predicate distinction, that there are at least two distinctions where Frege had thought there was only one, saturated, unsaturated. The way that you break sentences up in order to quantify is not the same as the way that you build atomic sentences out of their components.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So last up, we've got, where does that then leave the saturated, unsaturated distinction? So how much of that is tied to logical atomism, or do you think it's broader than that? Do you think then, if it's broader than that, Ramsey's argument manages to touch it? And then sort of, I suppose, do you think that the idea of there being a fundamental binary distinction between logical elements is one that does survive, should survive, in summary? Big question.
I still adhere to the idea that Begriffsschrift section 9 is right. So Begriffsschrift section 9 is where Frege explains quantification. I think that there's a paragraph there which I think is remarkable in its prescience, because what's remarkable about it is that's the paragraph where quantificational logic is born, and yet Frege seems to me to get it right first time in explaining how quantification works. I think that's a remarkable achievement. So I'll keep that if I can. I think the only mistake Frege made was Frege was so pleased by Begriffsschrift section 9 that he thought that distinction could be made to do all the work that logic needs. So by the time you get to Frege's Grundgesetze, which he intended to be his masterpiece, his work which laid out the whole of his logic, the logic of Begriffsschrift, but extended and improved, and then he hoped would develop the whole of arithmetic from that basis. Grundgesetze attempts to base the whole of logic on one distinction, saturated, unsaturated. So just to give you an example of how determined Frege was in this purism about this idea that it's all down to the saturated, unsaturated distinction, Frege there in Grundgesetze thinks, well, what about the two truth values, true and false? They're both saturated, right? They don't have an X or a Y, any argument placed in them. But the saturated and unsaturated distinction is the only distinction that logic makes. Therefore, the two truth values, truth and falsity, are, from a logical perspective, just objects. They're just two particularly interesting objects, but they're just objects. So in the Grundgesetze, truth and falsity are treated as objects among other objects. Sentences are treated as names of truth values. So sentences are names just like Hesperus and Phosphorus are names. It's just that Hesperus and Phosphorus are both names of a planet. Truth and falsity are names of two objects, two truth values. That's an example of how single-minded Frege was. Once he got an idea in his head, he just pushed it He pushed this idea that there's one distinction that the whole of logic is built on. And I think that in that he was wrong. So, and I think Ramsey explains quite well why he was wrong.
Yeah, I mean, metaphysically, it seems an odd claim to make, for sure. I think it has a certain sort of parsimony then, though, doesn't it, about how you can have truth function. Truth functions are similar to functions of objects of other sorts as well. So I can see the aesthetic appeal to it and the appeal from parsimony. It does raise certain metaphysical oddities and might be quite hard. And he knew it was difficult for people to accept it from a metaphysical point of view, because he would introduce it and then say, well, I know this is hard to swallow, and then they would try and justify it a little bit later. But I don't want to go too far into Frege on this video. I think we've done remarkably well, actually, got through universals in quite a succinct way that certainly I think made a lot of sense of it for me, and hopefully for everyone else listening. Is there anything you want to sort of say at the end that you didn't get to say, or a particular way to sum up, Michael?
I would encourage people who try to read the paper to go at it and accept that it's hard. There are some papers, there are some authors who are just beautifully clear. I mean, Russell was often wrong, but when he was wrong, I find it's usually pretty clear why he was wrong, because he wrote so clearly. Ramsey, at least in this paper, but I think in some of his other work too, isn't quite as clear. His argument in Universals is tangled, and that makes it harder to understand. But I think it's worth the effort.
Frege is very clear as well, I think. So there is a big difference there. Maybe that's why Ramsey isn't quite so famous as the others, because it does seem to make a big difference. All right, well, thank you.
Dying at the age of 26 doesn't help.
No, that was tragic. Certainly put me off ever swimming in the Cam, along with other things. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Michael. You're a wealth of information as always. Hopefully we can get you on later, because there's so many things we could talk about that have come off from this and from other conversations we've had. So thank you very much again for joining me, and see everybody on the next one. Bye-bye.